Welcome to the Relational Recovery podcast. I'm your host, Wes Thompson, joined by my co-host, Austin Hill. Today we're talking about grace. We hope this conversation is helpful, and thanks for listening. What's up, Austin? Happy first episode of September.
Yes, happy September. Good to see you.
It's good, man. Summer just flew by. It seems cliche to say, but I honestly can't believe we're here. It's pretty wild.
Mm-hmm. It's a fast time of year.
Like, I can't even remember what happened. It's weird. Yeah, I don't know. I just can't believe it's already fall. So, it's a cool morning. And here we are. I want to talk about grace today. You know, grace is something that in our Christian context, I hear often. And, you know, we're in a recovery community where people are living together and there's a standard of conduct. And oftentimes people are evaluating other people's behavior for better or for worse. And the word grace gets thrown around a lot. So I think it'd be good to have a conversation about grace because, you know, when I listen in on these conversations, sometimes I think that, man, I'm really blown away by how I think well-meaning the community is and how we want to do this well. But I think, you know, grace is something I think can be misunderstood at times. Like any words that I think we use regularly, when we don't, that's why often in this podcast, like we define words, because when you're in a context where words are used a lot, sometimes they can lose their meaning over time. To where it's like, in other words, it's like we say these words, but what do we mean by them? You know, there's the joke of like, we call it Christianese, where it's like these words we use, but just do people know what we mean by them, right? So let's start off with a definition, shall we? My favorite definition of grace is by a theologian who's still alive, although I think he's declining in health, so you can pray for him. But he's been influential in my life from a systematic theology perspective. He's probably written the most influential systematic theology in the last several decades, and his name is Wayne Grudem. He's a theologian. He wrote a pretty large systematic theology, but one in which it's actually pretty simple to read. A lot of those books are really difficult to read because for whatever reason, philosophers and theologians like to write in a very in a manner that's kind of hard to read. And Wayne Grudem defines
unapproachable.
Yeah, it's just very esoteric. Anyway, I digress. In his book, Systematic Theology, he what he does is he takes, what systematic theology is theologians will scour the Bible and find themes throughout the Bible and systematize them. In other words, what does the Bible say? Like, what does the Bible say about this theme or this concept? And grace is a concept that we see in Scripture. And Wayne Grudem defines grace as God's goodness towards those who only deserve punishment. So again, grace being God's goodness towards those who only deserve punishment. Now, why would people deserve punishment? Well, we know that Romans 3:23, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Biblical theology teaches us that sin is a part of the human condition. Sin is rebellion against God. Our willful choice to kind of go our own way and to make our own choices. You know, all of us listening to this, like, we can make choices in this moment for better or for worse. And so those choices result in consequences, both good and bad. And so when people choose to live a life in opposition to the way in which God made the world, that is a consequence of sin. And so sin is just a term that defines when people go the opposite way of God. That is classified as sin. And sin has consequence. And grace is that even when we sin, God is goodness towards good towards those who only deserve punishment. In our sin, we deserve punishment. And God shows us grace. And that's why it's good news. That's why it's good news, because God is chosen to be good towards imperfect people. So I could sit here and we could riff on that for a long time, but we're here to just talk about grace. So that we can give even though I don't necessarily want to, but we could give a systematic and biblical theology of salvation another day and sin another day. But today I want to talk about grace, which is specifically this idea that God chose to be good towards people who only deserve punishment, as Wayne Grudem's definition, which I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty great. I mean, that's good, right? You think of gospel, right? Gospel means good news, and that sounds like good news. I want people to be good to me. I want God to be good to me. I want those to be good to me, even when I don't deserve it. So that sounds awesome. But I think we need to unpack this a bit more. So I'm going to riff on a couple things here, Austin, and then I want to hear your response to it. But I think I haven't got quite to the meat of I think what I want to bring up today, because I think where grace often gets misconstrued is that grace cannot equate to like active grace does not necessarily equate to like passive cover up. I think sometimes we think of grace like, oh, well, we've all seen where people do unjust things, wrong things, sinful things even. And it doesn't seem like maybe a just response was done or justice wasn't done. And, we can say, well, man, they're just trying to cover up that. They're just being passive. They're not taking that offense seriously. And often that can be maybe communicated as gracious. And I don't think that's, I think I want to unpack that a little bit. Also, grace does not mean that we're flippant about bad behavior, because I think sometimes it can be viewed as almost like the culture of, we don't want to snitch on somebody. So like, that's gracious to just let things go. That's not what grace is. And then also, like, grace does not mean that there are no consequences for choices made. Oftentimes, I think grace can be construed as a free pass. And so to go back to the definition, and why I love Grudem's definition is it's so succinct, it's so clear, concise, and direct. But I think it really does embody what the Bible means when it says grace. Goodness, God's goodness towards those who only deserve punishment. But think about the word goodness. We have to ask ourselves, like, what is good in this moment? What is good towards the person? What is good towards the community? What is good for all parties? And so that's where discernment is required, I believe, and wisdom is required. Obviously, God shows us cosmic, ultimate grace in our salvation. God saves us from the penalties of sin, which is death, as Romans 3:23 says. But in that, like, we're not talking about salvation in this moment. So it's like, how do we show each other grace in all the other parts of life? Like, yes, God, like, the ultimate grace that we need is for salvation, right? But how do we show each other grace? How do we mimic God's grace, if you will, when somebody is nasty to us and steals from us and possibly we do these things, or we break earthly laws, and so on and so forth. What does grace look like in those contexts? Because again, I don't think grace equates to passive cover up. It doesn't mean that we're flippant about bad behavior. It doesn't mean that there's no consequences. So how do we live out grace? Or how do we live out a life of God in a gracious way? Because again, God's goodness towards those who only deserve punishment. And if we're going to be gracious to others, it means that we're good towards them, even if they deserve punishment. But oftentimes, I think what's good for people isn't always incredibly easy or clear in the moment. Because, for example, somebody, like, let's say that we're on a team and I consistently drop the ball, Austin. Like I consistently don't do what I'm supposed to do, to the point where it starts to erode trust from everyone else on the team. I do it so consistently that you start to believe that I don't care. I'm taking advantage of the team. We have to start to ask what's good for me in that moment. And what's good for me might be to be removed from the team. But somebody might say, well, that doesn't seem gracious. Well, and then I want to hear you respond to this. But the last point I want to make in this moment is grace does mean that we aim for the good of others as Christ is aimed for our good. But this requires discernment, because I could remove someone from the team and still want their good and believe that it's ultimately going to be good for them. Or I could remove them from the team because I hate them and because I'm trying to be malicious. And so sometimes grace is like a posture of heart as well, because I could be disciplined, or I could discipline someone else with the aim to hurt them or harm them. But I could also be disciplined or discipline someone with the aim to help them. And grace is obviously aimed at our good and the good of others. And so grace requires a lot of discernment, and it's not always as maybe straightforward as we want to think it is, because unfortunately, I think in our community, sometimes grace is used as a word that means that we should just let things go or something. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good biblical view of what grace means. So tell me, because in the Bible, sin isn't just unpunished, right? Jesus dies on the cross. I mean, there's like death involved, in remedying. So there's always going to be a consequence. But I'll just leave it there. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because that was the longest intro of probably any podcast we've ever done.
No, it's a big topic, and I think what I'm hearing is we're talking about the grace that we show to each other. We're not talking about God's grace shown to us, but defining God's grace shown to us in our attempt and desire to model that and show that to each other in the best way we can is messy, because we're not God. So how we show grace to one another, especially when somebody does something wrong, like how do we respond to that? That's what we're talking about today, correct? Is that kind of the distillation of what we're talking about?
We're talking about God's grace towards us, but but to your point, it's like, how do we show that grace to each other, right? What does it look like whenever we're trying to live out this grace in community?
Yeah, because so in community, that's the big, that's what makes it, I think, probably the most complicated. Because in any situation, if there's a harm done, there's three parties. It's the person who hurt someone, the person who was hurt, and then the community they live in. And how do those three work together to model out this love that we're asking of ourselves? Like, how do we do this in a good way? When we're seeking, you hit it right on the head. It's like we're seeking goodness for all three parties, right? Because if we use like the analogy or the example you used, where a team member is not following through so much so that it's negatively impacting the entire team, someone like they are doing something that's harming a team, or it's harming an individual, it's harming themselves. So how do we treat this person with goodness? And it is, I think it's identifying, like keeping the main thing, and it's not a character flaw. You're not saying like, well, this person is evil because they're not trustworthy or they're not doing this or that. It's this behavior is what we're addressing right now. This specific thing. And because we love this person and we know that we're all imperfect, trying to keep it as singular as we can when we're addressing each thing will help us move forward. Because if the goal is mutual respect, that means that the person who inflicted the harm is deserving of respect. But also at the same time, the person who was hurt, they deserve respect also. So it's how do you address those things? And it's by righting the thing that was wrong as best you can. And that means consequences. Because if something was made right, it means that it's coming out of something that's messy. It's not like, oh, like this person, cussed me out. And so that they're like, okay, I guess I won't do that anymore. It's like, well, if you do that again and again, and it's repeated, it's just like, obviously, like you're the person who's cussing somebody out. It's like you're dealing with something a bit bigger. It's usually your anger or how you like your attitude towards others. Like that's a bigger thing. So the respectful way or seeking goodness for that person is addressing what it is that they are dealing with without losing sight of like, hey, you're like going around, like a bull in a china shop. You're breaking a lot of stuff. That the breaking has to be addressed too, because it's not just like focusing on just one part of this. A honest, good way to address harm is looking at it from everybody's perspective and seeking out the respect and healing that each of those groups needs. Because like if we use it in the context of the refuge, if a guy does something that negatively, like he's wildly disrespectful, like if a phase 4 guy is wildly disrespectful to a phase 2 guy, it's not just the phase 2 guy that was hurt. Everybody in the ministry was hurt because someone is taking these tenets of like, hey, we care, like we value the relationship with each other. So it's that second principle. So we want us to have healthy relationships, and this person's breaking it. And now all these guys in second phase are distrustful of this fourth phase guy. It's like, well, if I don't trust this guy, maybe all the guys in fourth phase are jerks. So do you see how it gets bigger than just one guy hurting a phase 4 guy hurting a second phase guy's feelings? So that's what we're talking was like, how do we show this grace and goodness to each other? So I said all of that because this is why it's complicated, because it's not just like, oh, just get over it, guy whose feelings are hurt. It's like, no, you have to say like, dude, don't be a jerk. This is what it looks like to be a jerk. This is how you were a jerk. And it negatively impacted their relationship. You lost trust with everybody in this group. So now we're not going to trust you as much. That's a consequence. And to earn that, it takes time to earn that back. But then also the person who was yelled at and wildly disrespected, it's like, hey, not everybody feels that way. That person reacted in anger. It's building up their confidence again, saying like, hey, you aren't like whatever it is that they called you. It's like you are a needed and valued person, a member of this community. And it's going to take time for them to build that trust back up with the community. A great way to do that is for the community to come around both of them, one with accountability and the second with encouragement. That's how the community heals itself. Because if the community says, oh, we're going to ignore it, then nobody can trust anybody. Because if a community doesn't stand on something consistent, which is that grace that we're talking about, that goodness within the grace that we're talking about, no community can thrive. A healthy community cannot thrive or grow if there isn't accountability and encouragement or like the space to heal. So I think it's a very long response to your intro, but I think what both of us are getting at is like, it is not as easy as somebody does something wrong, then we say, "Oh, I'll show you grace," and then we'll move on. There's a process that requires time to rebuild the trust that was broken in a community of people, and that community has to stay consistent as it can, which is why we have like the principles we talk about here. It's like we value like the commitment to God and relationship with others is those first two. It's like we need to make sure that we keep the main thing, and know that people are going to value that and seek that mutually within each other. So it's not that somebody isn't more important than the community, and the community isn't more important than the individual, and that's just messy and complicated. So I don't know if I answered your question, but those are my thoughts on like how we show grace to each other. It's not losing sight of what was done, but realizing that what was done is we're addressing what was done by talking with multiple people about whoever was involved in this. It's like, oh, well, that person did that, so we're going to ostracize them or cut them out. So, yeah, there's a lot of different ways I could go, but what are you thinking now?
Well, it's interesting that you said like the way this has to be consistent, the community has to stand on something consistent. I started to think like, I wonder if that's why God gave us the law, because it's like, that's why we have laws in our society, is it creates a consistency of expected behavior. Because if not, we're all left to create our own version of what maybe we think is appropriate. But laws are essentially the community, the society agreeing on particular behaviors. And anytime groups have gotten together over the course of history, like they've created these systematic approaches to behavior and what's expected. And, if you obey the laws of the land, like you're in the community. And if you aren't, you're ostracized from the community. This has always existed. And I wonder if it's a way in which we image God, that there is, there's been a lot of talk in recent decades about how truth is relative, and there isn't such thing as like good and evil. But where that idea, I think, kind of starts to fall apart is, but people are always advocating for justice. Like there's something innately in us that just goes towards what is good and what is bad. I mean, listen to irreligious people talk. I mean, we're heading into an election year in America, and it's like, listen to how people talk. Like everything is centered around good and bad language. And so it's almost like this need for right and wrong and justice is kind of ingrained in us. And so in order for us to live in consistency, we have to fight for those ideals that ultimately are going to lead to the flourishing of ourselves and the people around us. And so I think you're absolutely right that grace is how can we be good to one another, but that keeps pointing towards good things. It's not like, it is about being good to each other, but it's also about, are we heading towards goodness itself? Because if we're just covering up bad behavior, like, is that going to lead to goodness? Like if I do something harmful and somebody sees it and they don't say anything about it because they call that grace, how is that good for me? Because I'm not learning from it. Like I'm able to just do it again. Like I need to learn and grow and change. And if poor behavior and bad behavior is not addressed, that's not good for the person doing the bad behavior, but it's also not good for the broader community. And that's not good, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's why why I split it into the three parties that are always active. In when harm is done, three parties are always active, and it's that community party that The reason why healing happens is because the community doesn't rally around just one of those. It rallies around both because the community can see itself in both. So a guy in the refuge who disrespects somebody, they like the community around them sees themselves in the person who inflicted the harm and experienced the harm. They can see themselves in both. Because if we go at a situation and say like, oh, I will only be the person who experiences pain, or I am the person who, so we have to protect that person, but we also have to see it from I am the person who can also inflict pain. What kinds of accountability do I need around myself, around us? Because that's the seeking mutual respect part, because we're not looking at just how do we protect one person from this. It's not like we're going to make a rule to protect this guy from this guy. It's like, no, we're going to make rules that push people towards building healthier relationships, which means there's a group of things that we say like, that's disrespectful. And we can all agree that we're not going to tolerate disrespectful behavior. But because we're imperfect, we know that one day I'm going to do something disrespectful. And this is the type of accountability I want because of it, because that is seeking out the goodness for me. It's because I'm going to be imperfect. I'm going to do something wrong. And when we put in the expectations to say like, hey, when I make a mistake, this is how I want to be held. This is how we want to be held accountable. It's not, well, I get held accountable one way and everybody else gets held accountable a different way for the same action. Like that's not seeking the goodness of everyone. So those are it just like the more I talk about it, it's a very complicated thing, but because we are these imperfect people that are trying to create a perfect community that we'll never experience, but the goal isn't like to create a perfect community. It's to create a community that's striving after that, at least striving after it, no matter how hard it is, because we're never going to reach that perfection that we're shooting for, which is a place where grace isn't needed because we're all perfect. Like that's like, just think about it. Like, it's like, man, I'm just so frustrated that like things go sideways. Like, well, yeah, because like we're people. But we want to be good people that are constantly improving and constantly getting closer to each other relationally, that we're getting better at communicating. We're getting better at holding each other accountable.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm going to read this from the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary because I think it gives an interesting angle. The writer says, God's grace comes to those who are in need and humbly approach God for help. Thus, both James 4:6, which is a book and chapter and verse in the Bible, and 1 Peter 5:5 reach back to Proverbs 3:34, which says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He writes, God's grace brings enablement to the helpless, especially the poor and persecuted. Paul had to learn that my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God's grace includes help in preaching the gospel and in enduring persecution. You know, I think one thing that stands out to me there is just this: God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. There's a posture of heart here. It's like, I think sometimes we use grace in a way to get by with things, but that's not how the Bible postures grace. Grace is about, like, again, am I coming from a posture of wanting to grow, wanting to be like God, wanting to, like, being humble? Or is it a place of trying to get away with something and being proud? Like, I think a really practical example is if you find yourself responding to someone and you don't desire good for them, then you really need to pause. You really need to pause. Because consequences are required in life. But also sometimes we have to give people multiple chances. Discernment's required there. But regardless of if you're giving someone another chance or if you're giving them a pretty severe consequence, what's required in all of those situations is that we desire the good of the other. We desire the good of the community. We desire good for ourselves. our actions being aimed at goodness. Because if we're going around wanting to cause harm, or if in our anger we're wanting to harm others because we think that they're worse than we are, we are going to create messes. We are going to become the perpetrators of sin. We are going to do more harm than good. So I think there's a caution there. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. It's like, are we leading and living in a way that is humble and not proud?
Yeah, because and what humbleness looks like in an attitude towards grace is realizing that, like, it is not just my job to give grace, it's also my job to receive grace. And to receive grace in a situation means I am admitting that I am imperfect and that I am going to mess up. So the grace that I'm like, so in kind of like how we're talking about, grace is not to be used in a community so that we just let bad behavior go. Grace is used in a community to encourage the truth to be revealed when bad behavior happens. Because when the truth is revealed, when bad behavior happens, then you can heal from it. And that is an example to the other people around you saying, like, gosh, this guy really screwed up. And then this group of people forgave him and held him accountable so he could improve for his goodness. And they also came around the person that experienced an injustice and helped them heal and encouraged them to grow. Like, grace is for a community to encourage itself to move in a better, more beautiful way, not to give, like, the okay to treat each other like crap, because that's not grace. That's not good. That's cowardice. Like, a community that's really motivated to seek out justice seeks out mutual justice for each other, for all of us, around a central theme. And since we are Christians, we're followers of Jesus, we're saying that our way of seeking justice is to redeem all things to Christ, not to my way of thinking or Wes's way of thinking or another person's way of thinking. It's to who Jesus is. And the reality is, like, we will never get there, which means we need each other to show each other grace and to hold each other accountable and to seek out consequences and healing with each other towards Jesus, not towards my idea or someone else's, but towards him. So grace should motivate us to better behavior, not if we say, like, oh, grace is just, going to let people get away with stuff. That's not grace.
Because that's not good. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not good.
So as we wrap this up, I think just things to leave us with, chewing on and thinking about and praying through, is just, again, this idea that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. So are we coming from a posture of being proud? Are we being humbled? Are we wanting the good of the community, ourselves and others? Grace does not equate to passive cover-up. Grace does not mean that we're flippant about bad behavior. Grace does not mean that there aren't consequences for our choices. Grace, by definition, is goodness towards those who only deserve punishment. So we have to be mindful, we have to be awake, we have to be aware that as we're living and leading, are we aiming to be good to others, towards others? Are we trying to aim for the good of the community, for the good of ourselves? Because sometimes that is straightforward and sometimes it's not. And it requires us to make decisions humbly with other people around us, getting feedback and being, using discernment. So again, hope this is a helpful conversation and good chatting with you, man. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Relational Recovery Podcast. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. We'll see you.